Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story is by Sheridan Fanu, Katherine's Quest. Imagine to yourself an old, rambling, red brick house with odd corners and gables here and there, all bound together and clasped together with ivy, and you have Kmore Grange. It was built long before Queen Elizabeth's time, and that illustrious monarch is said to have slept in it in one of her royal progresses, as where has she not slept? There still remain some remnants of bygone ages, although it has been much modernized and added to in later days. Among these are the brewhouse and the laundry, formerly, it is said, dining room and ballroom. The latter of these is chiefly remarkable for an immense arched window, such as you see in churches, with 5 lights. When we came to the Grange, this window had been partially blocked up, and in front of it, up to 1/3 of its height, was a wooden dais or platform, on which stood a cumbrous mangle, left there, I suppose, by the last tenants of the house. Of these tenants we knew very little, for it was so long since it had been inhabited that the oldest authority in the village could not remember it. There were, however, some half-defaced monuments in the village church of Kmore, bearing the figures and escutcheons of knights and dames of the old family, as the villagers said. But the inscriptions were worn and almost illegible, and for some time we none of us took pains to decipher them. We first came to Kmore Grange in the summer of 1849, my husband having discovered the place in one of his rambles and taken a fancy to it. At first I certainly thought we would never make it our home, it was so dilapidated and tumble down, but by the time winter came on, we had had several repairs done and alterations made, and the rooms really became quite presentable. As our family was small, we confined ourselves chiefly to the newest part of the house, leaving the older rooms to the mice, dust, and darkness. We made use of 2 of the old rooms, however, one as a servant's bedroom, and the other as an extra spare chamber in case of many visitors. For myself, though I hope I am neither nervous nor superstitious, I confess that I would rather sleep in our wing, as we called the part of the house we inhabited, than in any of the old rooms. When Katherine Lestrange came to us, however, during our first Christmas at Kmore, I found that she was troubled with no such fancies, but declared that she delighted in queer old rooms, with raftered ceilings and deep window seats, such as ours, and begged to be allowed to occupy the spare chamber. This I readily acceded to, as we had several visitors and needed all the available rooms. As my story has principally to do with Katherine Lestrange, I suppose I ought to speak more fully about her. She was an old school friend of my daughter Ella, and at the time of which I am speaking was just 21, and the merriest girl I ever knew. She had stayed with us once or twice before we came to the Grange, but we then knew no other particulars concerning her family, other than that her father had been an Indian officer, and that he and her mother had both died in India when she was about 6 years old, leaving her to the care of an aunt living in England. I now, after a long and I fear tedious preamble, come to my story. On the eve of the New Year of 1850, Katherine had a very bad sore throat, and was obliged, though sorely against her inclination, to stay in bed all day and forego our small evening gaiety. At about 6:00 p.m., Ella took her some tea, and fearing that she would be dull, offered to stay with her during the evening. This, however, Katherine would not hear of. "You go and entertain your company," she said laughingly, "and leave me to my own devices. I feel very lazy, and I dare say I shall go to sleep." As she had not slept much on the preceding night, Ella thought it was the best thing she could do, so she went out by the door leading on to the corridor, first placing the night lamp on a table behind the door opening onto the laundry, so that it might not shine in her face. She did not again visit Katherine's room until reminded to do so by my son George at about 10:30. She then rapped at the door, and receiving no answer, opened it softly and approached the bed. Katherine lay quite still, and Ella imagined her to be asleep. She therefore returned to the drawing-room without disturbing her. As it was New Year's Eve, we stayed up to see the old year out and the new year in, and at a few minutes to 12, we all gathered round the open window on the stairs to hear the chimes ring out from the village church. We were all listening breathlessly as the hall clock struck 12, when a piercing cry suddenly echoed through the house, causing us all to start in alarm. I knew that it could only proceed from Katherine's room, for the servants were all assembled at the window beneath us, listening, like ourselves, for the chimes. Thither, therefore, I flew, followed by Ella, and we found poor Katherine in a truly pitiable state. She was deadly pale, in an agony of terror, and the perspiration stood in large drops upon her forehead. It was some time before we could succeed at all in composing her, and her first words were to implore us to take her into another room. She was too weak to stand, so we wrapped her in blankets and carried her into Ella's bedroom. I noticed that as she was taken through the laundry, she shuddered and put her hands before her eyes. When she laid on Ella's bed, she grew calmer and apologized for the trouble she had caused, saying that she had had a dreadful dream. With this explanation, we were fain to be content, though I thought it hardly accounted for her excessive terror. I had observed, however, that any allusion to what had passed caused her to tremble and turn pale again, and I thought it best to refrain from exciting her further. When morning came, I found Katherine almost her usual self again, but I persuaded her to remain in bed until the evening, as her cold was not much better. Ella's curiosity to hear the dream which had so much excited her friend could now no longer be restrained, but whenever she asked to hear it, Katherine said, "Not now. Another time, perhaps, I may tell you." When she came down to dinner in the evening, we noticed that she was peculiarly silent, and we endeavored to rally her into her usual spirits, but in vain. She tried to laugh and appear merry, poor child, but there was evidently something on her mind. At last, as we all sat round the fire after dinner, she spoke. She addressed herself to my husband, but the tone of her voice caused us all to listen. "Mr. Fanshawe, I have something to ask of you," said she, and then paused. "Ask on," said Mr. Fanshawe. "I know that you will think the request I am going to make is a peculiar one, but I have a particular reason for making it," continued she. "It is that you have the wooden dais in front of the laundry window removed." Mr. Fanshawe certainly was taken aback, as were we all. When he had mastered his bewilderment, and assured himself that he had heard aright, "It is indeed a strange request, my dear Katherine," said he. "What can be your reason for asking such a thing?" "If you only have it done, and not question me, you will understand my reason," answered Katherine. Mr. Fanshawe demurred, however, thinking it some foolish whim, and at last Katherine said, "I must tell you why I wish it done, then. I am sure we shall discover something underneath." At this we all looked at one another in extreme bewilderment. Discover something underneath? No doubt we should. Cobwebs, probably, and dust and spiders, answered Mr. Fanshawe, much amused. But Katherine was not to be laughed down. "Only do as I wish," she said beseechingly, "and you will see. If you find nothing under the dais but cobwebs and dust, then you may laugh at me as much as you like." And I saw that she was serious, for tears were actually gathering in her eyes. Of course we were all very anxious to know what Katherine expected to find, and how she came to suspect that there was anything to be found, but she would not say, and begged us all not to question her. And now George took upon himself to interfere. "Let us do as Katherine wishes, father," said he. "The dais spoils the laundry, and it would be much better away." "Well, well," said Mr. Fanshawe, "do as you like, only I shall expect my share of the treasure that is found. And now," added he, "you must have a glass of wine to warm you, Katherine, for you look sadly pale, child." Here the conversation changed, although we often alluded to the subject again during the evening. The next morning the first thing in all our thoughts was Katherine's singular request. I think Mr. Fanshawe had hoped she would have forgotten it, but such was not the case. On the contrary, she enlisted George's services the first thing after breakfast to carry out her design, and they left the room together, accompanied by Ella. It was a snowy morning, and Mr. Fanshawe was obliged to be away from home all day on business, so I was quite at a loss how to entertain my numerous guests successfully. Happily for me, however, the mystery attendant on the removal of the dais in the laundry charmed them all, and I have to thank Katherine for contributing to their amusement much better than I could possibly have done. Not long after the disappearance of Katherine, Ella, and George, a message was sent to us in the drawing room requesting our presence in the laundry, and on all flocking there with more or less eagerness, we found a fire burning on the old-fashioned hearth and chairs arranged around it. It appeared that with the help of Sam, our factotum, who was a kind of jack of all trades, George had succeeded in loosening the planks of the dais, which, although strongly put together, were rotten and worm-eaten, and that we were now summoned to be witnesses of its removal. We found Katherine trembling with a strange eagerness, and her face quite pale with excitement. This was shared by Ella and George, and, judging by the important expression on their faces, I fancied they were let further into the secret than anyone else. We all sat down in the chairs placed for our accommodation, and the wild whistling of the wind in the huge chimney, together with the sheets of snow which darkened the window panes, enhanced the mystery of the whole affair, while George and his coadjutor worked lustily on. At length, after a great deal of panting and puffing, George was heard to exclaim, "Now for the tug-of-war," and there followed a minute's pause, and then a crash as the loosened planks were torn asunder, and a cloud of dust enveloped both workmen and spectators. Involuntarily we all started forward, and a moment of the direst confusion ensued, during which the boys of our party greatly endangered their limbs among the broken boards. "By George!" exclaimed my son at last, in his eagerness invoking his patron saint, as he stumbled upon something. "There is something here, and no mistake," and, hastily clearing away the rubbish and clinging cobwebs, he disclosed to view what proved on examination to be an immense oaken chest, about 4 feet in height, heavily carved, and ornamented with brass moldings corroded with age and damp. Here was a piece of excitement indeed. Never in my most imaginative moments had I thought of anything so mysterious as this. The most skeptical among us grew interested. "Oh, do open it!" cried Ella, when the first exclamations of surprise were over. "Easier to say than do, miss," replied Sam, exerting his Herculean strength in vain. With the aid of a hammer and a kitchen poker, however, he at last succeeded in forcing it open. We all pressed forward eagerly to peer inside. There was something in it, certainly, but we none of us could determine what, until Sam, who was the boldest of us all, thrust in his hand and brought forth something which caused the bravest to start with horror, while poor Katherine sank down, white and trembling, upon the littered floor. It was a bone, to which adhered fragments of decaying silk. The consternation and conjectures which followed can better be imagined than described. Seeing the effects of the discovery upon Katherine, and indeed upon all, I bade Sam replace it in the chest, which George closed again, to be left until Mr. Fanshawe came home and could investigate the matter. The rest of the day I passed in attending to Katherine, who seemed very much shocked and overcome by what she had seen, and in trying to divert my guest's thoughts from the subject, and dispel the gloom which had gathered over all. In this I succeeded only partially, and never did I welcome my husband's return more gladly than on that evening. Upon his arrival I would not let him be disturbed by the relation of what had happened until he had finished his dinner, and it was not until we were gathered as usual round the fire that George related the whole story to him. When he ended, the two gentlemen left the room together, in order that Mr. Fanshawe might verify by his own eyes what he could hardly believe. They were some time gone, and on their return I noticed that my husband held in his hand an old piece of soiled parchment with moldy seals affixed to it. "We certainly have discovered much more than I thought for, Katherine," said he, "and possibly more than you thought for either." He paused for her to reply, but she did not. "The bones are probably those of some animal," added he. I fancied that I could detect a certain anxiety in his tone that belied what he said, but in order to quell the active imaginations which I can see are running away with some of you, here he looked around with a smile, I will send for Dr. Driscoll to come and examine them tomorrow. I have also found a piece of parchment in the chest," he added, "but I have not yet looked at its contents." "Before you do that, Mr. Fanshawe, and before you send for the surgeon," interrupted Katherine suddenly in a clear voice, I think I can tell you all about the bones found in the chest and how I guessed them to be there." "I should certainly be very glad to be told," my husband admitted, much surprised, "though how you can possibly know, I cannot surmise." "Listen, and I will tell you," answered Katherine, and feeling very glad that our curiosity was about to be gratified, we all pricked up our ears, as George would say, to listen. I here transcribe Katherine's story word for word, as my son George subsequently wrote it down from her dictation. "You all remember," she began, "my alarming you on New Year's Eve at midnight, and that I told you I was disturbed by a dreadful dream. I said so because I thought you would make fun of me if I called it a vision, and yet it was much more like a vision, for I seemed to see it waking, and it was more vivid and consecutive than any dream I have ever had. Before I try to describe it, I want you all to understand that I seemed intuitively to comprehend what I saw, and to recognize all of the figures which appeared before me, and their relation to one another, though I am sure I have never beheld them before in my life. When Ella left me that night, I lay propped up with pillows, staring idly at the strange shadows thrown by the hidden lamp across the laundry ceiling and over the floor. As I looked, it seemed to me that a change came over the room, a most unaccountable change. Instead of the blocked-up window, the rusty mangle, and the dais at the farther end, I saw the window clear and distinct from top to bottom, and in front of a deep window seat at its base stood an oaken chest, exactly corresponding to the one discovered this morning. The room seemed brightly lighted, and everything was clearly and distinctly visible, and not only was it changed, but also peopled. Many figures passed up and down. Brocaded silks swept the floor, and old-world forms of men in strange costumes bowed in courtly style to the dames by their sides. Among all these figures, I noticed only one couple particularly, and I knew them to be bride and bridegroom. The man was tall and broad, with dark hair and eyes, and a sensual and cruel face. He seemed, however, to be quite enslaved by the woman by his side, whom I hardly even now like to think of. There was something to me so repellent in her presence. She was tall and of middle age, and would have been handsome, were it not for the sinister expression in her dark flashing eyes, which was enhanced by the black eyebrows which met over them. She reminded me irresistibly of the effigy on the stone monument in Kmore Church, which Ella and I named the Wicked Woman. As I gazed on the strange scene before me, I presently became aware of three other figures which I had not noticed before. They were standing in the small arched doorway in one corner of the room, where the servants' bedroom is now, furtively watching the gay company. One was a pale, careworn woman, apparently about 35, still beautiful, though haggard and mournful-looking, with blue eyes and a fair complexion. Her hands rested on the shoulders of two children, one a boy and the other a girl, of about 10 and 11 years respectively. They much resembled their mother, and, like her, they were meanly dressed, though no poverty of attire could hide the nobility of their aspect. I noticed that the mother's eyes rested chiefly on the face of the tall, stately man before mentioned, who seemed unaware or careless of her presence, and instinctively I knew him to be the father of her children and the blighter of her life. As I looked and beheld all this, the lights vanished, the company disappeared, and the room became dark and deserted. No, not quite deserted, for I presently distinguished, seated on the window seat by the old oaken chest, the fair woman and her children again. The moonlight now streamed through the window upon the woman's face, making it appear more ghastly and haggard than before. In her long, thin fingers she was holding up to the light a necklace of large pearls, curiously interwoven in a diamond pattern, and on this the children's eyes were fixed. She then hung it on the girl's fair neck, who hid it in her bosom. Both children then twined their arms around their mother and kissed her repeatedly, while her head sank lower and lower, and the paleness of death overspread her features. This scene faded away as the other had done, and I saw the fair woman no more. Then it seemed to me that many figures passed and repassed before the window. The wicked woman, as I shall call her to distinguish her, accompanied by a boy the image of herself, whom I knew to be her son. He was apparently older than the fair-haired children, who also passed to and fro, attired as servants, and generally employed in some menial work. At last the wicked woman's son, with haughty gestures, ordered the other boy to pick up something that lay on the ground, and when he refused, he raised his cane as though to strike him. Before he could do so, however, the boy flew at him, and they engaged in a fierce struggle. In the midst of this, the wicked woman, whom I had learned to dread, came forward and separated them, after which she pointed imperiously to the door and signed to the younger boy to go out. He obeyed her mandate, but first threw his arms around his sister in a last embrace, and she detached the pearl necklace off her neck and gave it to him. He then went out, waving a last adieu to her, and I saw him no more. Confused images seemed to crowd before me after this, and I remember nothing clearly until I beheld an infirm and tottering figure led away through the arched doorway, in whom I recognized the tall and stately man I had first seen in company with the wicked woman, but who was now an old man, apparently being supported to his bed to die. As he passed out, he laid one trembling hand upon the head of the fair girl, now a blooming woman, and a softer shade came over his face. This the wicked woman noted, and she marked her disapproval by a vindictive frown. She was also older looking, but age had in no degree softened her features. On the contrary, they appeared to me to wear a harsher expression than before. In the next scene which came before me, the wicked woman's son was evidently making love to the girl. Both were standing by the old window-seat, but her face was resolutely turned away from him, and when she at last looked at him, it was with an expression of uncontrollable horror and dislike. Again this scene changed as those before it had done. The young man was gone, and only the light of a grated lantern illuminated the room, or rather made the darkness visible. The wicked woman was the only occupant of the laundry. She was leaning by the oaken chest, trying to raise the heavy lid. In her left hand she held a piece of parchment, with large red seals pendant from it. I knew it to be the old man's will which she was hiding, thus defrauding the just claimants of their rights. Her hands trembled, and her whole appearance denoted guilty trepidation. At length, however, the lid was raised, but just as she was about to replace the parchment in the chest, a figure glided silently from a dark corner of the window-seat and confronted her. It was the fair girl, pale, resolute, and extending her hand to claim the will. After the first guilty start, which caused her to drop the parchment into the chest, the wicked woman hurriedly tried to close the lid. Her efforts were frustrated, however, by the girl, who leaned with all her force upon it, keeping it back, and still held out her hand as before. There followed a pause, which seemed to me very long, but which could in reality have only lasted a minute. It was broken by the wicked woman, who, hastily casting a glance behind her into the gloom of the darkened chamber, then seized the girl by the arm and dragged her with all her force into the chest. It was but the work of a moment, because the woman was much the more powerful of the two, and the poor victim was too much taken by surprise to make much resistance. I saw one despairing look in her face as her murderess flashed the lantern before it with a hideous gleam of triumph. Then the lid was pressed down upon her, and I saw no more, only I felt an unutterable terror and tried in vain to scream. This was not all the vision, however, for before I had mastered my terror, the scene was superseded by another. This time it was twilight, and the wicked woman and her son were together. The son seemed to be talking eagerly, and grew more and more excited, while the mother stood still and erect, with a malicious smile upon her lips. Presently she moved toward the chest with a fell purpose in her eyes, unlocked it with a key which hung from her girdle, raised the lid, and disclosed the contents. I understood it all now. The son was asking for the girl whom he had loved, and whom on his return home he missed, and the wicked woman, enraged at hearing for the first time that he had loved her, was determined to have her revenge. He should see her again. On beholding the dread contents of the chest, the man staggered back horrified. Then, doubtless comprehending the case, he turned suddenly upon the murderess, and threw his arm around her, and there ensued a struggle terrible to witness. Her proud, triumphant glance of malice was now succeeded by one of abject fear and, as his strength began to gain the mastery, of despair. His iron frame heaved for a moment with the violence of his efforts. The next, he had forced her down into the chest upon the mouldering body of her victim. I saw her eyes light up with the terror of death for 1 second, and then her screams were stifled forever beneath the massive lid. The horror of this scene was too much for me. I found voice to scream at last, and I suppose it was my cry which alarmed you all. When Katherine ceased speaking, there was a profound silence for a minute, which Mr. Fanshawe was the first to break, as he said with a peculiar intonation in his voice, "It is very strange, very unaccountable, re-echoing all our thoughts." Now it happened that Mr. Fleet, our family lawyer, was among our guests at Christmas time, and since the discovery of the chest and bones, had taken a great interest in the whole affair. He now questioned and cross-questioned Katherine, and seemed quite satisfied with the result. "This would have made a fine case," said he, "if only it had been a question on the right of succession for any lawyer to make out. But unfortunately the events are too long past to have any bearing on the present." There Mr. Fleet was wrong, though we none of us knew it at the time. We all now launched forth into conjectures and opinions, during which Katherine lay still and weary upon the sofa. I saw this, and thought it quite time to put an end to the day's adventures by suggesting retirement for the night, and we were soon all dispersed to dream of the mysterious vision and recovery. I think we were none of us sorry when morning dawned without any further tragedy. By us, I mean the female part of the establishment. When I came down to breakfast, I found Mr. Fleet very active on the subject of the night before. A surgeon ought to be immediately sent for to pronounce an opinion on the contents of the chest, he said, and Dr. Driscoll presently came, and after examining the bones minutely, decided that they were, as we thought, those of 2 females, who might have been from 1 to 200 years dead. Mr. Fleet next offered to decipher the will, for such he imagined the parchment to be, and he and Mr. Fanshawe were closeted together for some time. When they at last appeared again, they looked much interested and excited, and led me away to inform me of the result of their examination. They told me that the document had proved to be a will, but that there was a circumstance connected with it which greatly added to the mystery of the whole business. This was the mention of the name Lestrange. I was, of course, as much surprised as they, and heard the will read with great interest. I cannot remember the technical terms in which it was expressed. Mr. Fleet read me the translation he had made, for the original was in Old English, but it was to this effect. It purported to be the will of Reginald, Viscount St. Aubin, in which he bequeathed all his inheritance to his lawful son Francis St. Aubin, commonly known by the name of Francis Lestrange, and to his heirs forever. It was signed Reginald, Viscount St. Aubin, and the witnesses were Johnny Murray and Phoebe Brett, who in the old copy had each affixed their mark. Mr. Fleet affirmed that it was a perfectly legal document, but this was not all it contained. There was an appendix which our lawyer translated as follows. In order to avoid all disputes and doubts which might otherwise arise, I do hereby declare that my lawful wife was Editha, youngest daughter of Francis Lestrange, Baronet, and that the register of our marriage may be seen in the church of St. Andrew, Haslet. By this marriage we had 2 children, a son Francis and a daughter Katherine, commonly called Francis and Katherine Lestrange, and I hereby declare that Agatha Thornbaugh was not legally married to me as she imagined, my lawful wife being alive at the time, nor do I leave to her son by her first husband, Ralph Thornbaugh, any part or share in my inheritance. Both the will and the writing at the foot of it were dated the 14th of May, 1668. This accumulation of mysteries caused me for a time to feel quite bewildered and unable to think, but Mr. Fleet was in his element. "Here is a case worth entering into," said he, and he further went on to state that he had no doubt that the Lestranges mentioned in the will were our Katherine's ancestors, the Christian names being similar, rendering it more than probable. She was most likely a direct descendant of Francis Lestrange, the heir mentioned in the will, who who was no doubt also the fair-haired boy Katherine had seen in her vision. The bones were that of his sister, the murdered Katherine Lestrange, and of her murderess Agatha Thornbaugh, herself immured by her own son. But the matter ought not to rest on mere surmise, and the first place to go for corroborating evidence was Kmore Church. The rapidity with which Mr. Fleet came to his conclusions increased my bewilderment, and I was at a loss to know what evidence he expected to gain from Kmore Church. He reminded me, however, of Katherine's statement that the wicked woman of her vision resembled the effigy on the monument there. Thither, then, the lawyer repaired, accompanied by Mr. Fanshawe and George. It was thought best to keep the sequel of the story from Katherine and the others until it was explained more fully, as Mr. Fleet boldly affirmed it should be. I waited anxiously for the result of their researches, and they exceeded, I think, even our good investigators' hopes. Not only had they deciphered the inscription round the old monument, but with leave from the clergyman and assistance of the sexton, they had disinterred the coffin and found it to be filled with stones. I'm aware that this was rather an illegal proceeding, but as Mr. Fleet was only acting as an amateur and not professionally, he did not stick at trifles, and stated that the tomb was erected in memory of Agatha, wife of Reginald, Viscount St. Aubin, who was buried beneath, and who died on the 31st day of December 1649, exactly 200 years before the day on which Katherine had seen the vision. I could not help thinking it shocking that the villagers had for 2 centuries been worshipping in the presence of a perpetual lie, but Mr. Fleet thought only of the grand corroboration of his case. He applied to Mr. Fanshawe to take the next step, namely, to write to Katherine's aunt and only living relative, to tell her the whole story, and beg her to assist in elucidating matters by giving all the information she could respecting the Lestrange family. This was done, and we anxiously awaited the answer. Meantime, all my guests were clamorous to hear the contents of the will, and I had to appease them as best I could by promising that they should know all soon. In a few days, old Miss Lestrange's answer came. She said that her brother, father, and grandfather had all served in India, and that she believed her great-grandfather, who was a Francis Lestrange, to have passed most of his life abroad, there having been a cloud over his early youth. What this was, however, she could not say. She affirmed that the Lestranges had in old times resided in Blankshire, and she further stated that her father's family had consisted of herself and her brother, whose only child Katherine was. This was certainly not much information, but it was enough for our purpose. We no longer remained in doubt as to the truth of Mr. Fleet's version of the story, and when he himself told it to all our family party one evening, everyone agreed that he had certainly succeeded in making out a very clever case. As for Katherine, on being told that the figures she had beheld in the vision were thought to be those of her ancestors, she was not so much surprised as I expected, but said that she had had a presentiment all along that the tragedies she had witnessed were in some way connected with her own family. I must not forget to say that on ascertaining that the parish church of Hazlitt was still standing, we searched the register, and another link of evidence was made clear by the finding of the looked-for entry. There remains little more to be told. The charge of the old will was committed to Mr. Fleet, and Katherine's story has been carefully laid up among the archives of our family. I say advisedly of our family, for the line of the Lestranges, alias St. Aubins, has been united to ours by the marriage of Katherine to my son George, which took place in 1850. I who write this am an old woman now, but I still live with my son and daughter-in-law. George has bought Kmore Grange, thus rendering justice after the lapse of 2 centuries, and restoring the inheritance of her fathers to the rightful owner. I have but one more incident to relate, and I have done. A short time ago, old Miss Lestrange died, bequeathing all her worldly possessions to Katherine. Among these were some old family relics. Katherine was looking over them as George unpacked them, and she presently came to a miniature of a young and beautiful girl with fair hair and blue eyes, and a wistful expression, and with it a necklace of pearls strung in a diamond pattern. On seeing these, she became suddenly grave, and handing them back to me, said, "They are the same, the young girl and the pearl necklace I told you of." No more was said at the time, for the children were present, and we had always avoided alluding to the horrible family tragedy before them. But if we had still retained any doubt about its truth, which we had not, this would have set it at rest. If you were to visit Kmore Grange now, you would find no old laundry. The part of the house containing it has been pulled down, and children play and chickens peck on the ground where it once stood. The oaken chest has also long since been destroyed. The end.